Angelica had learned the exact weight of being unseen. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't light. It was a pressure constant. Quiet, like standing underwater while everyone else breathed air. At Belladonna's, invisibility was expected. The restaurant wasn't built for people like her. It was built for men who wore power the way others wore cologne. Subtle, expensive, unmistakable once you were close enough. Crystal glasses, low amber lighting, leather booths that swallowed sound. Deals were made here without paperwork. Promises were broken without witnesses. Angelica moved through it all with practiced restraint. Walk, pour, nod, leave. She never lingered. Lingering invited notice. Notice invited questions. Questions invited trouble. Her apron was always clean. Her hair always pulled back. Her face calm in a way people mistook for emptiness. In truth, her mind was rarely still. She cataloged everything. Voices, accents, pauses between words. She counted steps to exits. She noted who touched their glass when lying, who avoided eye contact, who spoke too carefully. No one ever asked how a waitress learned these things. They assumed she was nothing. Angelica preferred it that way. The night Thomas Moretti arrived, the room felt it before the door fully opened. Conversation didn't stop. It thinned, like air pulled from a sealed room. Laughter softened, then recalibrated itself into something more respectful. A politician at table 7 straightened his cuff. A financier glanced toward the entrance and then away, as if eye contact alone might be interpreted as challenge. Angelica was refilling water at the bar when she sensed it. Not fear, she'd learned the difference, but gravity, the kind that bent attention. Thomas Moretti walked in without haste. Mid-50s, impeccably dressed, no visible weapon, no visible guard. He didn't scan the room because the room already belonged to him. He moved like a man accustomed to silence following his steps. The maitre d' rushed forward, smiling too hard. A booth had already been cleared. People adjusted themselves unconsciously, making space. Angelica did not look up. That was the first mistake, though she didn't know it yet. She approached the table when it was her turn in rotation. No hesitation. She placed the water glasses down with steady hands. Thomas Moretti watched her. Most people did a double take when they realized who he was serving. Their eyes widened, their posture changed, their voices softened. Angelica's didn't. She said, "Still or sparkling?" Nothing more. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. One of the men at the table, a younger one, trying too hard, snorted. "Do you know who you're talking to?" Angelica waited. She always waited for the answer before responding. Thomas lifted one finger. The younger man froze. "Still," Thomas said calmly, eyes never leaving Angelica's face. And a moment. She nodded once and turned to leave. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She didn't bow. That was the second mistake. Behind her, chairs creaked as men shifted. Thomas felt something unfamiliar stir. Irritation, sharp and hot, followed by something colder. Curiosity. No one ignored him. They feared him. They flattered him. They tried to impress him. But ignore? Angelica returned with the water. As she poured, Thomas noticed the scars. They weren't obvious at first. Thin lines along her wrist, half hidden by the sleeve of her uniform. Pale against her skin, old enough to have softened, but deliberate, not accidental. His jaw tightened. "Stop," he said. Angelica stopped pouring. "You," Thomas said. "Look at me." The room went still. This was the moment most people broke. When the weight of his attention settled fully on them, when voices wavered, when apologies spilled out too fast. Angelica met his gaze. Her eyes were steady, not defiant, not fearful. Present. "Yes?" she asked. The word landed like a challenge, though she hadn't meant it to. Thomas's fury sparked, not loud. Controlled, the dangerous kind. He leaned back slightly, assessing her as if she were a puzzle that had insulted him by refusing to be simple. "You didn't acknowledge me when I arrived," he said. "I acknowledged your order. Angelica replied evenly. A few men inhaled sharply. You don't decide what acknowledgement looks like, Thomas said. Angelica hesitated, not in fear, but in calculation. She weighed silence against honesty. Habit told her to step back, apologize, disappear. Something else, older, deeper, rose instead. With respect, she said quietly. My job is to serve food and drink, not people. The room froze. The younger man laughed once, nervously. You've got some nerve. Thomas raised his hand again. Silence snapped back into place. He stared at Angelica, really stared now, at the tension in her shoulders, at the restraint in her voice, at the scars she was no longer trying to hide. You should apologize, he said. Angelica's fingers tightened around the tray. She thought of her mother, asleep in a small apartment with pill bottles lined like soldiers on the nightstand. She thought of the rent notice folded in her bag. She thought of all the times she had stayed silent when silence felt wrong. I won't, she said. Someone dropped a fork. Thomas felt the room lean toward him, waiting for violence, waiting for the lesson. He could ruin her with a word. He could end her job, her future, her safety. He didn't. Instead, he said, Why? Angelica didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet but unshaken. Because you're angry at being ignored, she said, not at being disrespected. And I didn't disrespect you. Thomas's fury faltered. Just for a moment. His gaze dropped, against his will, to her wrist again. Those scars, he said. Who gave them to you? This was not part of the script. This was not a question she was supposed to answer. But silence, she knew, could also be a lie. They're mine, she said, and they're not your business. Something shifted in Thomas's expression then. Not softness, recognition. He leaned back slowly, studying her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress, not as a problem, but as something dangerous in an entirely different way. Sit, he said. Angelica did not move. I'm working, she replied. A pause. Then Thomas Moretti did something no one in Belladonna's had ever seen him do. He nodded. Then bring me coffee, he said. And don't spill it. Angelica turned away, heart steady, unaware that in refusing to kneel, she had just forced power itself to pause. And Thomas Moretti, feared, untouchable, watched her go, unsettled by a single impossible thought. She is not afraid of me. Angelica carried the coffee like it weighed nothing. Her hands didn't shake. That was the part people never understood. Fear came later, when the moment passed and consequences arrived. In the moment, her body was precise, calm, useful. She placed the cup in front of Thomas Moretti and stepped back. Anything else? She asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the steam rise, watched the way she stood, feet planted, shoulders squared, ready to leave but not to flee. Most people leaned away from him without realizing it. Angelica leaned neutral, as if he were weather, as if he existed, but did not define her. You've worked here long? He asked. 2 years, she said. You've seen things. Angelica considered lying. The lie would have been easier, safer. Yes, she said instead. Thomas nodded, as if that confirmed something he already suspected. Around them, his companions sat frozen, unsure whether to speak or breathe. The younger man looked pale now, regret etched across his face for having drawn attention earlier. Thomas glanced at him. Just once. Leave us, Thomas said. The men hesitated. Now. Chairs scraped back. Bills were left unpaid. Within seconds, the booth was empty except for Thomas and Angelica. She did not sit. You can go, Thomas said, if you want. She didn't. Then speak, he added. Angelica's pulse finally quickened, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity of the situation. This was the moment that decided whether tonight would end quietly or follow her home. You asked about my scars, she said. That wasn't appropriate. No, Thomas agreed. It wasn't? The admission landed heavier than an apology. They're from a fire, Angelica continued. 8 years ago. A building collapse. I pulled people out until I couldn't feel my hands anymore. Thomas's brow furrowed. You're not a firefighter. No, she said. I was a medical student. Silence. That caught him. You quit, he said, not asking. I was expelled. For saving people? His tone sharpened. For falsifying records to get undocumented patients treatment, Angelica replied. They called it fraud. Thomas studied her differently now. The waitress uniform no longer fit the story. Too much restraint, too much vocabulary, too much control. You don't sound bitter, he said. I don't have the energy, she replied. Something in his expression shifted again. Not fury this time, but a tightening behind the eyes. Thomas Moretti had built an empire on reading people. He knew when someone lied to protect themselves. He knew when they lied to impress. Angelica wasn't lying at all. Why didn't you apologize? He asked quietly. It would have cost you nothing. She met his gaze again. It would have cost me myself. The words settled between them. Thomas leaned back, exhaled slowly. You know what people think happens when someone disrespects me. They think you destroy them, Angelica said. And? A corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile. Recognition again. You don't care, he said. I care, she corrected. Just not about power. That was when the shouting started. A crash near the entrance. Raised voices. The manager arguing with the man in a suit Angelica recognized instantly, not from the restaurant, but from television. Councilman Victor Hale. He was drunk, angry, loud in the way powerful men got when they forgot where they were. She spilled wine on me, Hale slurred, pointing at a young hostess. I want her fired. The girl was shaking. Wine stained the cuff of Hale's jacket, self-inflicted. Angelica could tell. He'd knocked the glass over himself. Thomas watched Angelica watch the scene. Not your problem, he said. Angelica's jaw tightened. The hostess whispered something, tears welling. Hale leaned in close, too close. Angelica moved before she could stop herself. Sir, she said calmly, stepping between them. That didn't happen. Hale turned, irritated. Who are you? She's my waitress, Thomas said, voice like iron. Hale froze, then laughed. Oh, I see. Slumming it tonight? Angelica felt the line snap inside her. She didn't spill anything, Angelica said. You did. I saw it. And the cameras will confirm. Hale sneered. You accusing me of lying? Yes. The word rang. Thomas didn't interrupt. Hale's face darkened. You better be careful. Angelica didn't raise her voice. Threatening a witness is a felony. Hale scoffed. You don't know what you're talking about. Angelica reached into her apron and pulled out a folded receipt. She smoothed it on the table. You signed this 2 minutes ago, she said. Your signature waives confidentiality if a crime occurs on premises. Section 3, subsection B. Thomas leaned forward, eyes sharp. Hale paled. You memorized the contract? Thomas asked. Angelica nodded. They tried to short my tips once. The room was silent again. Not stunned now, recalibrating. Hale backed up a step. This is ridiculous. Leave, Thomas said softly. Hale hesitated, then left. The hostess exhaled, sobbing. Angelica squeezed her shoulder once, grounding, then turned back. Thomas was watching her like she'd just shifted the ground beneath his feet. You didn't do that for me, he said. No, Angelica replied. I did it because silence would have made me complicit. Thomas sat back slowly. For the first time that night, the fury that defined him had nowhere to land. Instead, something heavier settled in its place. Respect. And the quiet, dangerous understanding that this woman, this waitress, had just altered the balance of a room full of powerful men without raising her voice once. Outside, sirens wailed distantly. Inside, Thomas Moretti made a decision that would unravel everything he thought he controlled. Angelica, he said, tasting her name, you're coming with me. She didn't flinch. "No," she said. The refusal hung between them. Thomas smiled then. Slow, measured, unmistakably real. "Then," he said, "I'm going to have to ask properly." And for the first time in decades, he meant it. Thomas Moretti did not repeat himself. That was another thing people knew about him. When he spoke, the world rearranged itself to comply. Doors opened, laws softened, men disappeared. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was efficiency. Power, to Thomas, was a system, predictable, reliable. Angelica's refusal broke that system. Not loudly, not theatrically, just enough to expose its seams. "You misunderstand me," Thomas said calmly. "I'm not ordering you." Angelica studied him for a moment. She searched for threat, for manipulation, for the familiar hooks of coercion. She found none. "Then I'm listening," she said. Thomas gestured toward the booth. "Sit." She hesitated. "This isn't about obedience," he added. "It's about privacy." Angelica weighed the room. The staff pretended not to stare. The hostess she defended watched her with wide, grateful eyes. Angelica exhaled once and sat, on the edge, ready to stand, Thomas noticed. "You're always ready to leave," he observed. "People who can't leave are easy to control," she replied. A pause. Then a nod. "Fair." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You embarrassed a city councilman tonight." "He embarrassed himself," Angelica said. "You corrected him in public," Thomas continued. "Men like him don't forgive that." "I know. Then why do it?" Angelica's gaze didn't waver. "Because he was going to hurt her. And because I know what happens when people like him are never contradicted." Thomas's fingers tapped once against the table. "You think you do? I do," she said. "I've treated the aftermath. That caught him again. You went back to medicine?" "Informally," Angelica said. "Free clinics, shelters, anywhere that doesn't ask questions." Thomas studied her like a chessboard suddenly rearranged mid-game. "You realize," he said, "that you could have just made your life much harder." "Yes." "And you did it anyway." "Yes." Silence settled between them. Not tense now. Deliberate. Thomas leaned back. "Come with me," he said again. Not as an order. Angelica crossed her arms. "Then as what?" "As an offer," he said. "A temporary one." She waited. "I have a problem," Thomas continued. "And you noticed something tonight that no one else did." "What's that?" "That power doesn't scare you." Angelica shook her head. "That's not true." "Oh?" "It does," she said. "I'm just more afraid of being quiet when I shouldn't be." Thomas felt the truth of it settled deep. He'd built his empire on loyalty and fear. Moral courage was rarer and more dangerous. "I need someone who will tell me when I'm wrong," he said. "And who won't lie to survive." Angelica let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You're asking a waitress to be your conscience." "I'm asking a doctor who understands systems," Thomas corrected. "And contracts. And people." "I'm not your employee," she said. "I wouldn't want you to be," he replied. "I want you to choose." She studied him carefully now. The offer was real. The danger was real. And so was the opportunity. "What's the problem?" she asked. Thomas's voice lowered further. "Someone is poisoning my inner circle." Angelica's pulse spiked. "Poisoning?" "Slowly," he said. "Undetectable compounds. Symptoms that look like stress. One of my lieutenants collapsed last week. Another has memory gaps." Angelica's mind shifted gears instantly. "Clinical. Focused. Who has access to food and drink?" "Everyone," Thomas said, "which is why I need someone invisible." She looked at him sharply. "You're not asking me to spy." "I'm asking you to observe," he said, "and tell me the truth." Angelica considered the weight of that. "And if I say no?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Then you walk out that door, with my protection. No consequences." She searched his face for the lie. Found none. Angelica stood. "I have conditions." Thomas smiled faintly. Of course you do. One, she said. No one gets hurt because of me. He raised an eyebrow. No retaliation, she clarified. No disappearances, no warnings. Thomas inhaled slowly. That limits my options. Then you don't need me, she replied. Another pause. Longer this time. Agreed, Thomas said finally. Two, Angelica continued. I leave when I want. No guards following me home. Thomas nodded. Done. Three, she said. Voice steady. If I believe a child is in danger, I act. You don't stop me. Thomas's jaw tightened. You don't have children, she added. You don't know what that costs. The room held its breath. Thomas thought of his nephew, of the boy's cough, of the doctor's reassurances that never quite reassured. Agreed, he said quietly. Angelica nodded once. When? She asked. Tonight, Thomas said. She hesitated, then reached for her apron strings, untied them slowly, deliberately, laid the apron on the table. I'll need my bag, she said. Thomas stood. For the first time he offered his hand, not to command, but to steady. Angelica looked at it, then shook it. Outside, the night waited, thick with danger, possibility, and the unmistakable sense that something irreversible had begun. And Thomas Moretti, feared by a city, followed a waitress into the dark, aware that power had just accepted its first condition. The car smelled like leather and restraint. Angelica sat in the back seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes tracking reflections in the tinted window. The city slid past, neon signs, closed storefronts, the quiet after midnight that made everything feel exposed. Thomas sat across from her, silent. He wasn't watching the road. He was watching her. You're calmer than most people on their way into my life, he said. I've been in worse ambulances, Angelica replied. That earned a quiet huff of amusement. Not laughter, something closer to release. They arrived at a private residence outside the city. High walls. No visible cameras. The kind of place that didn't need them. Inside, the air was sterile and tense. 3 people waited in the main room. 2 men, 1 woman. All powerful. All pretending not to stare at Angelica like she was a strange object that had wandered into their ecosystem. This is Angelica. Thomas said, she'll be observing us. One of the men scoffed. A waitress. Angelica met his gaze. Former medical student. The woman leaned forward slightly. Expelled, she said knowingly. Angelica felt the hook. Yes. Thomas raised a hand. She's here because I trust her judgment. That shut them up. They began to talk. Meetings. Logistics. Health complaints disguised as jokes. Angelica listened. She noted tremors in hands, missed words, delayed reactions. She asked questions when necessary. Simple, neutral ones that sounded harmless. What time do you usually eat? Who prepares the drinks? Any recent changes in suppliers? It's not the food, she said finally. All eyes turned to her. It's the glassware, Angelica continued. Microdosing through residue. Whoever cleans them is adding something that evaporates too quickly to detect. The woman swore under her breath. Thomas nodded once. You're sure? Yes. Angelica said, and it's someone trusted. Family or long-term staff? Silence fell heavy. Thomas's voice was low. My sister oversees the household. Angelica didn't soften the truth. Then start there. The air thickened. No one spoke. Thomas stood slowly. You'll stay, he said, until this is resolved. Angelica met his gaze. I said I leave when I choose. He inclined his head. And you're choosing to stay. She considered, then nodded. Days blurred into vigilance. Angelica moved quietly through the estate, observing patterns. She treated symptoms discreetly. She watched a child, Thomas's nephew, grow paler each day. The boy liked her. You don't talk like them, he said once. I talk like people, Angelica replied. One night, she caught Thomas's sister altering the glasses. There was no confrontation, no violence. Angelica simply removed the compound and replaced it with water. Then she left a note. I see you. Stop. The poisoning stopped. The truth, however, did not. The note did more damage than any accusation could have. Thomas's sister, Lucia, found it folded neatly beside the sink at dawn. No signature, no threat, just 4 words written in a steady hand. I see you. Stop. Lucia stared at it for a long time. Then she burned it. By noon, the compound was gone. The glassware returned to its original rotation. Symptoms eased. One lieutenant stopped shaking. Another remembered a conversation he'd lost 2 days earlier. Thomas noticed everything. He did not ask Angelica what she had done. That, too, was a shift. Instead, he watched her more closely, not as a tool, not as a risk, but as a presence that altered the behavior of everyone around her. Staff stood straighter. Voices softened. Lies became more careful. Angelica did not confront Lucia. She did not expose her. She treated her migraines. She adjusted her medication. She said nothing. Lucia hated her for it. You think you're better than us, Lucia snapped one evening when they were alone in the kitchen. No, Angelica said calmly. I think you're hurting. You have no idea. Angelica met her gaze. I have more idea than you think. Lucia's hand trembled. He would have destroyed me. He still might, Angelica said. But not because of me. That night, Lucia packed a bag. She didn't run. She didn't confess. She simply left. The internal threat dissolved without spectacle. Thomas called it mercy. Angelica called it containment. The difference mattered. Days turned into weeks. Angelica remained. Not because she was trapped, but because she chose to stay. She set boundaries like lines in stone. She refused luxury. She slept in a modest guest room. She insisted on transparency when decisions affected innocent people. Thomas listened. Not always immediately, not always comfortably, but he listened. Once, during a heated discussion about retaliating against a rival group, Angelica interrupted. You don't need to punish them, she said. You need to make them irrelevant. The room went quiet. Thomas considered the idea, then implemented it. The rival collapsed within months. No bloodshed. Angelica noticed the pattern and named it one night when Thomas asked her why things felt different. Power adapts when it's forced to, she said. You're learning restraint. He studied her over a glass of untouched whiskey. You make it sound like a virtue. It is, she replied. If you choose it, choice. The word lingered between them, growing heavier with each passing day. Thomas never touched her without permission, never raised his voice at her, never demanded. That, too, was new. But the real disruption came when the truth surfaced. Lucia didn't disappear quietly. She went to the authorities, not to confess, but to accuse. She told them Thomas had poisoned his own men to consolidate control. The story was plausible. The investigation was swift and public. Cameras, headlines, frozen accounts. Angelica watched the news from the edge of the room as Thomas stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back. They'll come for you, she said. They already are, he replied. You can run, she added. He shook his head. Not this time. Angelica turned to face him fully. Then you need to tell the truth. Thomas's jaw tightened. The truth will destroy everything I've built. Or rebuild it, she said. He looked at her then, not as a strategist, not as a savior, but as someone whose opinion mattered more than his empire. Stand with me, he said quietly. Angelica didn't answer immediately. Then, only if I'm not protecting you from consequences. A long silence. Agreed, Thomas said. The hearing was brutal. Lucia testified first. Tears, half-truths, just enough accuracy to feel real. Then Angelica took the stand. No uniform, no makeup, just scars visible at her wrist. unhidden. She spoke clearly, methodically. She explained microdosing, glassware, residue, timelines. She produced the altered compounds Lucia had failed to destroy. She did not mention the note. She did not plead. She simply told the truth. The room shifted. When the verdict came, Thomas was cleared. Lucia was arrested. The press called it a miracle. Angelica called it evidence. Afterward, Thomas found her alone in the courtyard, staring at the sky. "You could have exposed me too," he said. "You saw everything." "Yes," Angelica replied. "Why didn't you?" She turned to him, expression calm. "Because reform is harder than revenge." Thomas felt something give way inside him, something old and rigid. "Stay," he said, not as a command, not as a plea. "As what?" she asked. "As yourself," he said. "With me." Angelica looked at the estate, the power, the danger, then back at him. "I'll stay," she said, "for now." And in that moment, Thomas Moretti realized the greatest threat to his world wasn't exposure or betrayal. It was the woman who had taught him that power could kneel and still stand. Angelica learned the sound of danger before it arrived. It wasn't footsteps or raised voices. It was the sudden politeness, the way people stopped arguing when Thomas entered a room, the way information began arriving pre-filtered, softened at the edges, as if reality itself were trying not to offend him. That was the cost of staying close to power. She noticed it within days of the hearing. Reports grew shorter, explanations thinner, decisions framed as inevitabilities instead of choices. Thomas trusted her, but the system around him was already adapting, already trying to protect itself from the disruption she represented. That made her dangerous. And danger, in Thomas's world, never went unanswered for long. It started with a delivery, a small wooden box left at the gate one morning. No return address, no note. Inside, a burner phone and a single photograph. Angelica recognized the building instantly. A free clinic in the South District. Peeling paint. Broken sign. A place she volunteered twice a week, quietly, under a different name. The photo showed the back door, unlocked. She brought it to Thomas without drama. "They know," she said. He didn't ask who. His jaw tightened, eyes darkening, not with rage, but with calculation. "This is a warning." "Yes," Angelica agreed. "Not from your enemies. From mine," he said. "From someone inside," she corrected. That distinction mattered. Thomas called an emergency meeting. Angelica did not attend. That was another boundary she insisted on. "I don't need to hear plans that involve violence," she'd said once. "And I won't be used to justify them." Instead, she went to the clinic. She moved faster than usual, mind alert, senses stretched thin. She checked exits, counted people, watched for patterns. Nothing happened, which worried her more than if something had. That night, Thomas found her sitting in the courtyard, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. "You're thinking about leaving," he said. Angelica didn't deny it. "Staying puts other people at risk." "Leaving doesn't remove the risk," Thomas replied. "It just removes you from the room." She looked at him sharply. "You're asking me to choose you over them." "No," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to choose where you can do the most good." She searched his face for manipulation, found none. Still, the weight of it pressed hard. "Power is contagious," Angelica said. "I won't let it make me complicit." Thomas stepped closer, but stopped short, respecting the invisible line she always drew. "Then don't be," he said. "Change it." The simplicity of the answer startled her. "You think that's possible?" she asked. "I think you're already doing it," he replied. The real test came 2 days later. Thomas's nephew collapsed at breakfast. Not poison this time, something else. Sudden, violent, seizure-like. Angelica was there before anyone else moved. She caught the boy's head, cleared the airway, shouted instructions. Her hands were sure, her voice steady. "Call emergency services. she ordered. Thomas hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Do it. That half second would have been unthinkable months ago. At the hospital, the diagnosis was swift and devastating. A rare neurological condition. Manageable if treated early. Lethal if ignored. He needs ongoing care, the doctor said. Specialists. Monitoring. Thomas looked at Angelica. You're not leaving, he said. Not as a demand, but as a realization. Angelica swallowed. I won't be his doctor, she said. Conflict of interest. I didn't ask that, Thomas replied. I asked you to stay. She looked at the boy through the glass, small and pale in the hospital bed. I'll help set the system, she said slowly. Then I stepped back. Thomas nodded. On your terms. The attempt came that night, not at the estate, not at the clinic, at a charity gala. Angelica hadn't wanted to attend. Public spaces were volatile, unpredictable. Thomas had agreed until the invitations went out. They're testing visibility, he'd said. If you don't appear, they'll escalate. Angelica went, not in a gown, but in a simple black dress. No jewelry, no pretense. The crowd watched her more than they watched him. That was new. Halfway through the evening, a waiter tripped near her table. A glass shattered. Liquid splashed dangerously close. Angelica moved instantly, knocking the glass aside, grabbing the waiter's wrist before the second vial could be deployed. The room erupted. Security surged. Guests screamed. Angelica held the waiter's arm locked, voice calm in his ear. Don't move, he sobbed. They said it was harmless. Thomas arrived seconds later. He took in the scene, the vial, Angelica's grip, the terror in the man's eyes. And then he did something unprecedented. He waved security back. Let him go, Thomas said. Angelica looked at him. Thomas, trust me. She released the waiter. The man fled. The room buzzed with confusion. Later, alone, Angelica confronted him. You let him go, she said. Why? Because fear made him useful, Thomas replied. And you taught me fear is a poor foundation. She stared at him, searching. You're changing, she said. So are you, he replied. Angelica felt the truth of it. And the danger. Change always demanded a reckoning. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was preparing to force one. Power doesn't resist truth all at once. It leaks first. Small inconsistencies. Delays. Overcorrections. The people closest to Thomas began behaving as if they were standing on a fault line. Careful, tense, afraid to move too much in any direction. Angelica felt it in the air. You've destabilized the hierarchy, Thomas said one night, not accusing, observing. Hierarchy that relies on silence deserves destabilization, she replied. He accepted that. What he didn't yet accept was the cost. The waiter from the gala was found 2 days later, alive, shaken, talking. He hadn't been hired by a rival syndicate. He hadn't even known Thomas's name. He was recruited through debt, medical bills, a sick partner, an impossible choice dressed up as an opportunity. Angelica listened to the recording in silence. They promised it wouldn't kill anyone, the waiter sobbed. Just make him sick. Just long enough. Angelica closed her eyes. This wasn't about removing Thomas anymore. This was about discrediting restraint. Someone wants you to retaliate, she said, publicly. Thomas nodded. So that when I do, they can say nothing's changed. Yes, Angelica said, and they win either way. Thomas stared at the city lights beyond the window. Then we don't give them either outcome. The plan that followed was not his. It was hers. We expose the mechanism, Angelica said. Not the people, the system. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You want to dismantle my own operation. I want to separate loyalty from fear, she replied. If it can't survive that, it shouldn't. Silence stretched. Finally, Thomas said, You realize what you're asking me to risk. Yes, Angelica said. Do you? He smiled faintly. You're the first person who's ever asked me that. The exposure came in layers. Financial audits leaked, not to the press, but to regulators. Shell companies dissolved quietly, donations redirected, contracts rewritten with transparency clauses that made old habits impossible. People panicked. Some fled, others stayed and adapted. But one man didn't. Marco DeLuca had been with Thomas from the beginning. Blood loyalty. Family history. He had lost brothers to build the empire Thomas now restrained, and he hated Angelica for it. She's weakening you, Marco said openly. One night, you're hesitating. I'm choosing, Thomas replied. That's the problem. Marco moved fast after that. He went to the press, not with lies, but with truth carefully framed. Photos, old records, Angelica's expulsion, her work in undocumented clinics. She's manipulating him, the headlines implied. A radical with a savior complex. They'll come for you, Thomas said. They already are, she replied. The subpoena arrived the next morning. Angelica was called to testify, not against Thomas, but against herself, her past, her choices, her ethics. This is the pivot, Thomas said quietly. You can walk away. Angelica shook her head. If I do, they learn silence works. At the hearing, they tried to break her. They questioned her authority, her credibility, her right to speak in rooms she wasn't born into. Angelica answered calmly, I don't seek power, she said. I seek responsibility. They pressed harder. Do you love him? One councilman sneered. Angelica paused. Thomas felt his breath catch. I respect him, she said carefully. And I expect him to be accountable. The room shifted. Marco watched from the back, smiling. Then Angelica did something no one expected. She rolled up her sleeve. The scars were fully visible now. Burns, surgical marks, evidence of hands that had held too much pain for too long. These, she said evenly, are from pulling people out of a fire while others argued about liability. She lowered her arm. I was taught silence is professionalism, she continued. That obedience is safety. I've learned that's a lie. She looked directly at Marco. And so is loyalty that demands harm. The murmurs grew. The narrative cracked. By the time the hearing ended, the question was no longer whether Angelica belonged in the room, it was whether anyone else did. That night, Marco made his final move. He didn't target Thomas. He targeted the clinic. The call came just after midnight. Angelica was awake, she often was, sitting at the small desk in her guest room, reviewing medication schedules for Thomas's nephew. The phone vibrated once. No number. Just vibration, insistent and wrong. She answered without speaking. They're here, a voice whispered. They're breaking in. The clinic, Angelica was already moving. Shoes, jacket, keys. Her mind snapped into clean, ruthless order. Listen to me, she said into the phone. Get the children into the back room. Lock the steel door. Do not open it for anyone except emergency services. Do you understand? Yes, Angelica. They have guns. Do not argue, she said, voice steady. You stay alive. I'm on my way. Thomas was outside her door before she reached it. He had heard the shift in the house, the sudden coordination, the sharp footfalls, the instinctive readiness of men who sensed imminent violence. What is it? He asked. The clinic, Angelica said. Marco. Thomas's face went cold in a way she had never seen. I'll handle it, he said, already turning. Angelica grabbed his arm. No, she said. You'll escalate it. He stopped, slowly turned back to her. They're threatening children, he said quietly. I know, she replied, which is why you can't be the one who walks in. The air between them tightened. You said, Angelica continued, not releasing his arm, that if a child was in danger, you wouldn't stop me. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the fury was still there, but caged. What do you need? He asked. A car, she said. No guards, and your word you won't retaliate unless I ask. That last part hurt him. He nodded anyway. Take mine, he said, and Angelica. She met his gaze. Come back, he finished. I will, she said. The clinic parking lot was chaos when she arrived. A door hung open, splintered, shouting inside. A child crying, hi, terrified, unmistakable. Angelica didn't slow. She stepped through the broken doorway and raised her voice, not in fear, but in command. Stop. 3 men turned, armed, masked, amateur, desperate, Marco's people. But not Marco himself. You're in the wrong building, Angelica said calmly. There are no assets here, no leverage, just witnesses. One of the men laughed shakily. You think we won't? Angelica stepped closer. I think you're scared, she said, and that you were told this would be easy, that no one would get hurt. Silence. She gestured toward the back room. There are 7 children behind that door. If you open it, every line you've told yourself stops working. The men hesitated. Angelica took another step. You walk away now, she said, and I guarantee protection. Legal? Financial? Medical. I've already documented everything. Names, faces, orders. A lie, but a plausible one. And if we don't? The tallest man asked. Angelica met his eyes. Then you live with what you do next. The crying stopped. That did it. One by one, the men lowered their weapons. They fled. Angelica locked the door behind them and slid down the wall, breath finally shaking. She stayed until morning, until police arrived, until the children slept again. Thomas arrived last. He took in the damage, the fear. Angelica sitting on the floor, back straight despite exhaustion. You stopped them, he said. Yes, she replied. How? I told them the truth, she said. And let them choose. Thomas knelt in front of her, not physically, emotionally. I would have burned the city, he said quietly. I know, Angelica replied. That's why I went instead. That was the moment something irreversible happened. Marco DeLuca was arrested that afternoon, not by Thomas's men, but by federal agents acting on evidence Angelica had quietly assembled over weeks. Financial trails, recorded threats, witnesses who finally felt safe enough to speak. No blood, no retaliation, just consequence. The empire did not fall. It transformed. Weeks later, Thomas stood before his organization and did what no one expected. He stepped back, not from leadership, but from fear. He restructured, removed those who resisted accountability, opened channels once sealed, put systems in place that could outlast him. Angelica watched from the edges, as she always had. You could stay, Thomas said one evening. Officially. She shook her head. I was never meant to belong to this, she said gently. Only to change it? And us? He asked. She met his gaze. We choose every day. Or we don't. Thomas nodded. The clinic reopened with better security, better funding, better futures. Angelica returned to medical school under a different name. Quietly. On her terms, the scars on her wrist remained. Not hidden, not explained, just present. And somewhere in the city, power learned a lesson it would never forget. Silence is not weakness, and the smallest voice, when it speaks from truth, can force the loudest empire to kneel. Power doesn't collapse all at once. It exhales. The weeks after Marco DeLuca's arrest were filled with that strange, hollow quiet that follows a storm, when everything looks the same, but nothing feels secure yet. People waited for retaliation that never came, for bodies, for messages written in blood. They waited for Thomas Moretti to remind the city who he was. He didn't. Instead, meetings were canceled. Accounts were frozen by design, not surprise. Men who had once enforced fear found themselves reassigned or dismissed entirely, given severance and warnings instead of threats. Rumors spread fast. He's gone soft. He's losing control. He's being controlled. Angelica heard them all and said nothing. She had returned to the margins, where she belonged best. Back to clinic shifts, back to borrowed textbooks and late-night study sessions, back to being unseen. Except now, invisibility was a choice, not a sentence. Thomas respected that. They spoke less, but when they did, the conversations mattered. No drama, no promises, just truth. One evening, weeks after the clinic incident, Thomas came alone, no guards, to the free clinic after closing hours. He stood awkwardly near the doorway while Angelica finished charting. "You don't have to be here," she said without looking up. "I know," he replied. That was becoming their language. She closed the file and turned to him. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," he said. Then, after a pause, "No, I don't know." She waited. "I've spent my life solving problems with force," Thomas continued. "Even restraint used to be strategic, temporary. You made it permanent." Angelica studied his face, the lines deeper now, not from stress, but from thought. "That scares you," she said. "Yes," he admitted. "And it shouldn't." "No," she agreed, "it shouldn't." They sat in silence for a while. The clinic hummed softly around them. A place built on healing, not control. "I'm stepping back further," Thomas said eventually. "Letting a board handle oversight. External audits. Real ones." Angelica nodded. "That's necessary." "And you?" he asked. "What are you doing now?" "I reapplied to medical school," she said. "Under my own name this time." He smiled. Small, genuine. "Good. I won't ask you for favors," she added. "I wouldn't offer them," he replied. "That's the point." They shared a quiet smile then, mutual understanding hard-earned. Outside, life moved on. The headlines shifted. New scandals replaced old ones. Thomas Moretti became less myth, more man. Still powerful, but no longer untouchable. And Angelica became something rarer. She became free. The hearing that followed months later was different from the first. No ambush, no spectacle. Just a formal review of past actions, structural reforms, and future accountability. Angelica was called again, not as a witness against anyone, but as a consultant. She accepted under one condition. "I speak plainly," she said, "even if it's uncomfortable." The committee agreed. When she testified, she did not talk about Thomas first. She talked about systems. "How fear concentrates power," she said. "How silence disguises harm. How moral courage is often mislabeled as insubordination." Then, finally, she spoke about him. "Thomas Moretti is responsible for many things," she said. "Some unforgivable, some repairable. What matters now is not who he was, but who he allows the system to become without him." The room listened, not because of who she stood beside, but because of who she was. Afterward, a young woman approached her in the hallway, nervous, determined. "I work in procurement," the woman said. "I've been ignoring things I shouldn't." Angelica met her eyes. "What do you want to do?" "I want to speak," the woman said. "But I'm scared." "That means you're paying attention." She handed the woman a card, not with a number, but a sentence written on it. "Silence protects the wrong thing first." The woman folded it carefully, like something fragile and important. That night, Angelica stood on her apartment balcony. Small, rented, hers. The city stretched out below, indifferent and alive. Thomas called once. "Dinner," he said, "if you want. No expectations." Angelica smiled softly. Another time, she replied, "I have studying to do." "Of course," he said. No disappointment. Just respect. When the call ended, Angelica leaned against the railing and closed her eyes. She thought of the waitress she had been, the student she had lost, the woman she had become. Power had tried to define her. She had refused, and in doing so, she had changed it. Not by conquering it, but by insisting it choose. Time did what time always did. It revealed what was real. Angelica's days narrowed into focus. Classes, clinics, long nights with anatomy texts spread across her kitchen table. The work was brutal, familiar, honest. She welcomed the exhaustion. It grounded her in something earned. The world Thomas inhabited felt farther away now, like a city seen from across water, still present, still humming with danger and influence, just no longer pressing against her skin. That distance mattered. It made the offer possible. It came not with drama, but with paperwork. A thick envelope arrived one afternoon, hand-delivered, no insignia. Inside were documents, clean, precise, unmistakably deliberate. A foundation, healthcare access, legal protections for undocumented patients, transparent funding, independent oversight. No Thomas Moretti in the name. No quiet ownership clauses buried in the margins. Angelica read every page twice. Then a third time. Her phone rang. "I didn't send that to buy you," Thomas said before she could speak. "Or bind you." "I know," she replied. "If you say no," he continued, "it goes forward anyway." That made her close her eyes. "You've learned something," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, "from you." She didn't answer right away. "Come see it," he said. "Or don't. Choice still stands." Angelica went, not because she felt pulled, but because curiosity, like courage, demanded witness. The building was modest, brick, sunlit, already staffed, already functioning, not a monument. A system. She walked the halls, asked questions, read reports. Nothing hidden, nothing ornamental. "You didn't make yourself the hero," she said finally. Thomas stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Heroes rot systems. I wanted it to survive me." She turned to him. "And me? You're not part of the structure," he said. "You're part of the permission." That stopped her. "Say yes or no," he added. "But if you say yes, it's as a boundary, not a figurehead." Angelica thought of the clinic, of the night with the guns, of the children sleeping through terror because someone had spoken when silence was easier. "I'll advise," she said. "Nothing more. Done." They stood there, not touching, not closing distance that hadn't been invited. "You're different now," she said. "So are you," he replied. "That doesn't mean together," she said gently. "No," Thomas agreed. "It means honest." That night, Angelica returned home and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The final test came quietly. A subpoena, this time for Thomas alone. Old charges resurfaced. Not fabricated. Real. Deferred, forgotten because power had made forgetting easy. He told Angelica the same night. "They're right," he said. "About some of it." She didn't flinch. "What are you going to do?" "I won't fight it," he said. "I won't run." Angelica studied him carefully. "That will cost you." "I know. And you're choosing it," she said. "Yes." That was all she needed to hear. When the news broke, the city reacted with disbelief. Then noise. Analysts argued. Allies vanished. Enemies circled. Angelica said nothing publicly. She didn't need to. The foundation held. The clinic stayed open. The reforms continued without interruption. That was the point. Thomas stepped down from everything with his name on it. Accepted sentencing negotiations. Lost wealth. Lost immunity. He did not ask her to stand beside him. He did not ask at all. That was the last and greatest proof. They met once more before the end. No lawyers. No guards. Just two people sitting across from each other at a small cafe that smelled like bread and coffee. "You'll be gone a while," Angelica said. "Yes," Thomas replied. "Do you regret it?" He thought carefully. "I regret not learning sooner." She nodded. "That's fair." They sat in comfortable silence. "I won't promise anything," Thomas said finally. "About the future." Angelica smiled faintly. "I wouldn't trust you if you did." He smiled back. When they stood, he didn't reach for her hand. Neither did she. They embraced briefly, human unguarded, and then stepped apart. As equals, years later, when people told the story, they got parts wrong. They said a waitress tamed a mafia boss. They said love saved him. They said power changed overnight. Angelica knew better. Power hadn't been defeated. It had been taught to choose, and choice, freely made, morally held, was the only kind of power that lasted. Prison had a way of clarifying things. Thomas learned that quickly. Without the constant hum of obligation, without men waiting for his decisions or systems bending around his presence, time stretched into something honest. Days were measured by routine instead of consequence. Silence was no longer strategic. It was simply there. He did not suffer the way people expected him to. He did something harder, he reflected. Angelica did not visit it first. That was deliberate. Not punishment. Not distance. Just respect for the choice he had made. For the boundary he had honored. She understood something most people didn't. Closure wasn't owed. Presence wasn't proof. Sometimes the most ethical thing you could do was let someone walk the path they chose alone. She wrote instead. Short letters, no sentimentality. Updates about the foundation, the clinics, the progress of programs he had set in motion and then released. The system is holding. Oversight flagged a gap. It was corrected. 3 new clinics opened this quarter. Nothing about feelings. Everything about outcomes. Thomas read every word like scripture. Outside, the world adjusted. The myth of Thomas Moretti thinned into history. Younger men tried to claim his shadow and failed. They lacked the patience, the restraint, the strange humility that had come at the end. The city didn't become good. It became slightly less cruel. That was enough. Angelica moved forward. Medical school consumed her in the best way. Exams, rotations, exhaustion that came from effort instead of fear. She excelled quietly. Professors noticed, but didn't hover. She preferred it that way. She never hid her scars. When asked, she answered simply, no drama, no narrative. They're from helping, she'd say. That was all. The foundation flourished precisely because it wasn't hers, or his. It belonged to process, to transparency, to systems that didn't require exceptional people to function ethically. That was Angelica's greatest contribution. Not disruption, design. Years passed. When Thomas was finally released, older, thinner, unmistakably changed, there were no crowds waiting, no cameras, no enemies with knives hidden in smiles, just air, and a choice. He did not call Angelica immediately. That, too, was intentional. He found work instead, consulting on compliance, teaching young men how power collapsed when it stopped listening. Most didn't understand him. A few did. Those few mattered. The letter came on an ordinary day. I'm free. I hope you are too. Angelica read it twice. Then once more. She wrote back, I am. Coffee if you want. No expectations. The cafe was unremarkable. That was the point. Thomas arrived early, nervous in a way he hadn't been in decades. Angelica arrived exactly on time. They sat. They talked. About medicine. About systems. About how strange it was to live without an audience. They did not talk about the past unless it served the present. At one point, Thomas looked at her and said, You were right about silence. Angelica nodded. And you were right about choice. They sat in that truth, letting it breathe. When they stood to leave, nothing dramatic happened. No declaration. No promise. Just a shared understanding that whatever came next would be chosen. Again and again and again. Angelica walked home alone. The city felt lighter than it once had. Not safer, not kinder, just less inevitable. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and set her bag down. On the wall above her desk hung a single sentence framed simply, Silence protects the wrong thing first. She touched the frame once, then turned back to her studies. There was work to do. Years later, when people tried to explain what had changed, they always reached for spectacle. They talked about the night a waitress stood up to a mafia boss. They talked about courtrooms and arrests and scandals. They talked about power kneeling, about a man undone by a woman with nothing to lose. They missed the point. Change didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived quietly. It arrived the way Angelica always had, without asking permission, without demanding attention, without confusing volume for truth. On a warm afternoon, long after the headlines had moved on, Angelica stood in a hospital hallway watching a group of interns rush past her. She wore a white coat now, her name stitched neatly at the chest. Dr. Angelica Reyes. She had earned every letter. A young nurse hesitated near the wall, clearly overwhelmed, clearly afraid to speak. Angelica noticed. Because she always did? "What is it?" she asked gently. The nurse swallowed. "I think the chart is wrong. But the attending," Angelica nodded once. "Show me." They corrected the error together, quietly. A patient slept safely because of it. No one applauded. That was the point. Across the city, the foundation continued its work. Clinics opened and closed based on need, not prestige. Systems were audited. Power flowed through accountability instead of fear. Thomas served on no boards, held no titles. When people recognized him, some still flinched, others asked questions. He answered honestly. "I built something wrong," he would say. "Then I learned better." Some believed him, some didn't. It didn't matter. The system no longer required belief. It required participation. Angelica and Thomas met occasionally, always by choice, never by habit. Sometimes for coffee, sometimes for silence. There was affection there, deep and earned, but never ownership, never obligation. They stood side by side, not intertwined. Two people who had changed each other without consuming one another. That was the real miracle. One evening, Angelica returned to Belladonna's. The restaurant looked the same. The lighting, the booths, the soft piano music. But the air was different, less tense, more human. A young waitress approached her table nervously. "Can I get you anything?" the girl asked. Angelica smiled. "Just water." Still. The girl nodded and turned to go. Angelica noticed the way she walked. Careful, invisible, practiced. "Hey," Angelica said softly. The waitress turned back. "You don't have to disappear to do your job," Angelica told her. "You're allowed to exist." The girl blinked, surprised, then smiled, small, real. "Thank you," she said. Angelica watched her walk away, feeling the echo of something old and heavy finally loosen its grip. Later, as Angelica stepped outside into the evening air, she paused and looked up at the city. Power still lived here. So did fear, so did cruelty. But now, threaded through it all, was something quieter and far more dangerous to the old order. Choice, the kind that didn't ask permission, the kind that didn't wait to be invited, the kind that spoke when silence would have been easier. Angelica adjusted her coat and walked on. Not as a symbol, not as a legend, but as proof. Silence is often mistaken for safety, obedience for wisdom, power for authority, but the world doesn't change when the loudest voice wins. It changes when the quietest one finally refuses to stay quiet. And that choice, made once, and then again, is how power learns to kneel. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see power differently, subscribe, because the quietest voices often tell the stories that matter most.